If you're a longtime comic book fan, you've probably seen many fights between the Man of Steel, Superman, and the original Captain Marvel, better known today as Shazam. But their first battle was not in the pages of a comic book, or an animation, or even on the movie screen. Their first conflict was in a courtroom in the 1940s and 50s. The Golden Age Captain Marvel was so threatened by the legal super strength of Superman, he turned to Popeye the Sailor Man to save the day. But even though Popeye is strong to the finish, he could not fight off the courtroom assault of the Man of Steel. The first Captain Marvel was cancelled for years after this defeat. Let's look at the trial that brought these three heroic titans together for the first, but not the last, time. Hello and welcome to my channel, where I ramble about the heroes, villains, and monsters of fiction. I am what I am. And if you like this video, think about liking and subscribing. Now, on with the video. National Comics introduced Superman in Action Comics #1 in 1938. Created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, Superman was an instant sensation, changing the face of the comic book industry forever. On the heels of this wild success, numerous similar characters were created to cash in on the popularity of the Man of Steel. The most popular of these was Billy Batson, the original Captain Marvel, who is today called Shazam. Introduced in Whiz Comics #2 in 1940, Captain Marvel was created by Bill Parker and C.C. Beck for Fawcett Comics, a rival to National Comics. Captain Marvel soared in popularity, threatening National Comics due to his impressive sales. In fact, Captain Marvel was featured in a movie serial in March of 1941, becoming the first comic book superhero to be adapted into live action. National Comics attempted legal action in June of that year, requesting a cease and desist for the serial, but they failed, and the movie serial was a success. This led to Captain Marvel becoming the most popular comic book in the country. For most of the 1940s, it outsold Superman and every other comic book. This was the last straw for National Comics, and they began a lawsuit against Fawcett Comics, hoping to force them to stop publication of Captain Marvel. The lawsuit began in September 1941, and would be fought in a courtroom for several years. This is where Popeye the Sailor Man comes into our story. How does Popeye fit into all this, you may wonder? Good question. Lawyers for National Comics had a 150-page binder filled with panels from both the Superman and Captain Marvel comics to show the obvious similarities between the two characters. To counter this strategy, the attorneys for Fawcett Comics decided to prove that Superman writers stole ideas from earlier characters, and therefore the lawsuit was being made in bad faith. Fawcett researched previous fictional heroes to find evidence of this, and the character they focused on for most of their defense was Popeye the Sailor. Popeye was created by E.C. Seeger in January 1929 as a character in his long-running newspaper comic strip Thimble Theater. Beginning as a supporting character, Popeye was so popular he took over the strip, which was later renamed after him. Popeye was soon adapted into a series of cinematic animated cartoons produced by Max Fleischer Studios, the same people who coincidentally also produced the well-regarded series of Superman cartoons in the early 40s. This spinach-eating sailor was utilized by Fawcett Comics to prove Superman was not original. You might be thinking, huh? What? Popeye? Really? Yes, really. Fawcett laid out their reasons and presented a reasonably compelling case. Here's what they came up with. Popeye was an orphan, discovered alone on a boat floating down a river. Superman was an orphan from Krypton, found by the Kents on a rocket ship which landed in a Kansas cornfield. Popeye frequently displays feats of superhuman strength, including bending steel in his hands. Superman also had super strength, and part of the introduction of his radio show was able to bend steel in his bare hands. Popeye was frequently described as a Superman. He was first called a Superman in 1931, 7 years before Clark Kent debuted. Popeye showed a level of invulnerability before Superman came along. In his debut story, he survives a hail of bullets, and after some sleep and a good meal, he walks out of the hospital the next day, unhurt, shocking the doctors with his miraculous recovery. In another story, a villain tries to cut his head off with a sword, but can't cut through his skin. His neck is described as being like wire. In still another story, Popeye survives ingesting large amounts of poison water. Popeye clearly pioneered the idea of the invulnerable hero. In other similarities, Popeye has a supporting cast of characters with alliterative names, such as Olive Oil and Wellington Wimpy. Superman has supporting characters with alliterative names, such as Lois Lane and Lex Luthor. Popeye lives in the little town of Sweet Haven, while Superman comes from the little town of Smallville. Like a good hero, Popeye has a rogues gallery of recurring supervillains, including the Sea Hag, Alice the Goon, and Tawa the Immortal Caveman, who preceded the concept of Vendel Savage by many years. Popeye is a noble hero with a heart of gold who travels the world with his girlfriend and helps out innocent people by defeating an assortment of strange villains. These are the arguments that Fawcett Comics put forward to prove that Superman was as much a copy as Captain Marvel was, and so the lawsuit was in bad faith. Did it work? No, it did not. The court was not having it. Despite the Popeye argument, the law ruled against Fawcett Comics in 1948. While Fawcett appealed the decision in 1951, they lost again in 1953, and Captain Marvel was canceled from publication. The Captain remained in comic book limbo until 1972, when the former National Comics, now called DC Comics, bought Captain Marvel, making him part of the DC Universe, which he remains till this day. As for Popeye, he would meet Superman one more time. Well, sort of. 1 year after Captain Marvel became part of DC, an obvious Popeye stand-in would battle the Man of Steel. In February 1973, in issue 421 of Action Comics, Superman battles a nautical antagonist with a similar appearance to Popeye. The character was called Captain Strong, and he got his power from eating a green plant called Stauncha instead of spinach. The comic actually acted as an anti-drug PSA, since the Stauncha that gave Captain Strong his power also made him go berserk, requiring Superman to stop him. Once again, Superman won. So that's the strange history of the time Superman, Captain Marvel, and Popeye the Sailor met in a legal slugfest, and the Man of Steel came out on top. Captain Marvel was knocked out, and Popeye couldn't save him. And that's the end of my video. And if you feel it was strong to the finish, feel free to leave a like or a comment, or maybe even subscribe, like Popeye subscribing to Spinach Lovers Weekly. Until next time, have a super day.